Good morning. Ayin Beis, Volume 2. We're on page 1180. Aleph Kuf Pei. If you want to follow the text, go to ayinbeis.com. There the text is, the PDF of these pages is all uploaded. So as I explained yesterday more at length, and I'm not going to go over the whole thing again, where we are now is rounding out and like finishing up the discussion that began 184 pages ago about V'yadaita Ayin v'shavesa levavecha ki Hashem hu Elikim. So after a long explanation on the two perspectives, Daas and Daas, the Rebbe Rashab is now applying it to our lives. And the application consists of, as he put it in the beginning of this Maimer, to use the words, Kishem sheyesh beis deis l'mayla, just as there's two perspectives above in the divine, the higher perspective, that the yesh amiti, the true reality is God, is the source. And the Ayin is everything else is nullified entirely in the presence of that higher truth, which is the true reality, God. And that's tachten, that the reality, the existent reality is the given reality. And from there we discover, and in it we discover the divine that's embedded within it. He says, same thing in the human being, in us. We need to have Beis Deis, and that's Yechida, Yechida Tata. Those are the two ways in our experience, in human experience, that we experience the unity with the divine. One is a unity from Yechida Tata, which is discovering the divine within our existence and relating to that's primarily in Avodah, it's al pitam v'das, in an orderly, step-by-step way that we understand it, we internalize it, we integrate it. And Yechida Allah, the Adam, is relating to the bittul of the higher levels, specifically the Kelim of Atzilus, that we're talking about a divine level as it gets encompassed in its source, and there it gets completely nullified in that presence, and that's the Yechida Allah experience, because it's not about existence relating to the divine and recognizing the divine in like you said, in Yediyah, in Hargasha, which means both in awareness, in feeling, and ultimately in action, the Birurim, when we refine and transform the material world. But now we're talking about not a birur of the waste, birur of the holy from the mundane, the divine from the mundane, but rather here it's a birur called oichel mitoich oichel, which means in holiness itself, you recognize that the divine energy is really completely nullified in the presence of its source. As he explained, not compared to the oir that's in the keli, but the oir that's beyond the keli, Ein Sof, as he called it, on page 1180. You just use the words here. Nasim kelim el oir b'avedu bitl eshel ma'alama oir mislabish b'kelim. Right, and through this they become kelim to the oir. And in Aveda, this is the Aveda of Re'usa Dili, but not the rational that we relate to and understand. We contemplate on the divine within existence and then come to relate to it. Now we're talking about the neshama's natural inner desire to be connected to God. Like he brings from Tanya, chapter 19, that the neshama is like a flame, ner Hashem nishmas adam, and just like a flame naturally gravitates to its source, even though it will become completely nullified and absorbed in the source. Same thing with the neshama. It wants to connect to the source, even though it becomes ayin v'efes, because it's not about the divine being revealed in existence. It's about the spiritual levels being absorbed in their source, and that he calls the bitl of chachma shebenefesh. And this is iskalus shalamayla bitlan. Now, this is a bitl of iskalus being encompassed in that which is higher than you are, and that's the second shiluv. The first one is shiluv adnai. Shiluv Havaya Ba'adnai. This one is Shiluv Havaya Adnai Ba'Havaya, Yechudi Allah. And that reveals Ein Sof Shalamayel Mishtalshlus. Das Elyon, that Tzilus Hanugili, B'chinasher Shemakara Ishtalshlus. So now we're revealing a higher level of the divine in and that is higher than it's the root and source of Ishtalshlus. Okay, that's where we didn't stop completely. We did continue, but now he's going to go further because remember, especially if you recall in the first volume, when he spoke about the journey of the Sfiras are first from the word Sfira comes from number, narrative, Sipur, Mispar, Sipurs, narrative, and Sapir, transparent. As I discussed yesterday, and I'll just sum up again, remember, all this is a journey. It's a process of us connecting to the divine, us connecting to something greater than ourselves. So clearly, it's a step-by-step process. Yesterday, I especially went to read what we read back 184 pages ago, back on the page, what was it? Aleph, let me see. The Tov Kuf Tzadik Zayin, I believe it was. Yeah, 996 and 97. So remember, we went through that. It's a step-by-step process. So right now, we've talked about two steps, two main steps. One is Yechida Tata, one is Yechida Elah. One is from the Yesh, which is self-contained entity, you come to recognize the divine within it, that everything is, and everything you do gets driven toward L'Shem Shamayim for the sake of heaven, not for your own sake. And level two is that in the divine itself, you elevate from Elikus to higher levels of Elikus that are beyond structure. Basically, the second level of Re'usa Deliba. As I mentioned briefly yesterday, this sounds all like Pnimi still, because it's Eris and Kalim, as they recognize the that's higher than Eris and Kalim. We'll soon talk more the details of that. Now he's going to go and says this Yediyah, this V'yadaita Hayoim, the Yediyah that we're talking about. Remember, Yediyah is not just knowing, it's not just information. Like he said, it's not just Havana and Hasaga, it's not just that you know, but you feel, you recognize, it resonates, it's internalized, as we learned about Daas. So now he's continuing this journey of Daas with the next step we go to. So far, two steps. One is the divine as it relates to us, and one is the divine beyond us. Or you can say the divine higher than those Kalim in the Shiur Shemokar V'Shtalshlus. But the journey isn't over, we know. There's higher levels, and now he's going to take us to the next step, where Yediyah, awareness, and our awareness, and which is the mitzvah for us to become aware, takes us yet to another level. And here he introduces the concept that Das leads you to beyond Das. He says like this. I'll read it again from where we started yesterday. Page 1180, the line that begins, Chulu, v'zeu b'chinas Das Elyon. So the end of the line, he says, Ach, amitis inyan Das Elyon. We mentioned Das Elyon, and we understood why is it called Das Elyon, the higher perspective, because it's Chachma, Vatzilus, and it's taking the Kalim to appreciate and be completely nullified. The Heder Tfisas Mokim, as we said, nullified in the presence of that which is higher than Atzilus and higher than the Oyer within the Keli. Okay, but he says that, but however, the true Das Elyon, which means obviously a Das Elyon that's even higher than Atzilus, not Das Elyon Atzilus, because remember there's Das Elyon on many levels. He says, Amitisin Das Elyon U'Kamaimer, and here he introduces Tachlis HaYediyah Shalei Neda. That the ultimate of Yediyah, the ultimate of this Das that we're discussing, is not just to know the divine within our existence, not just to know the divine that takes us from the Kalim of Atzilus to that which is the Eidos beyond Kalim, but it's Shalei Neda, comes to help us reach, and that is V'hula Hakiru Lahargish, to recognize and to feel Esa Ein Sof. The infinite, that's not known in any form of comprehension at all, which would suggest that till now, even the higher level was still in some grasp, we had some grasp over it, at least in a direct way. Now he's going to explain what this means. This is where we stopped. So we're going now to a third level, basically, a higher level of Das Elyon. Inyan hu. And what's the inyan in this? He's going to explain. Dihine das shehu akara Das, which we said earlier, is hakara. Das is not just knowing something, not just understanding something. It's recognizing it, identifying with it. Remember, personalizing it. I actually just, for the record, I on the app, on WhatsApp, on the group, I referenced two Maimorim from the Frierdiker Rebbe, one in Tov Shin Aleph, one in Tov Reish Tzadik Dalet. There, he gives an example for Das. One example he gives when somebody's standing in front of a painting and gets completely mesmerized by it. Not just he recognizes it's a nice painting. It's not just he knows what it's, and he knows and appreciates what the painting is about, but he gets completely absorbed, identifies with it. That's one example that he gives in detail. Another example he gives is actually a sugi in Gemara, that when you're learning something in Gemara, he actually brings an example. And the gay here what the example is, but the whole thing with a field. So when you learn a Gemara, let's say the halacha about a field, the different laws that apply to a particular soda that you own. If you don't own the field, it's a theoretical sugya. But if you own the field, then the sugya suddenly comes alive because it's negated to you. That's what he says there. So in other words, you can learn about something, a type of heichet timtza, a scenario that you don't have any connection with. But then you can learn something that you relate to. That's something that happened to you. Or it's important to your business negotiations or dealings, this particular halacha, this particular sugya in Gemara. Then that's das. You suddenly have a personal connection, identification with the sugya. It's still not pure emotion, but if you remember, it's the interface to emotions. Because now it's become an idea that you relate to. There's a famous story with the Reb Marash, an expression, where he was asked by the Razor, by the Rebbe Rashab, not positive, or Chassidim. He said, they asked the question, the Gemara we find, Abaye and Rava are two colleagues who disagree about different matters. And he says, they sit in the Gemara, you find them discussing the theories of a shifra charufa, of essentially a maidservant. Like what she would argue and what would be her intentions. So someone has the Reb Marash, she need a Abaye and Rava are trying to understand a shivcha charufa. Shivcha charufa is a simple maidservant. Why does it come easy to her? And Abaye, you need the two great sages and scholars to try to figure out what she would think. So the answer that Marash said is simple. Because it's negated to her. When it's negated to you, you don't need to be a gaon, you don't need to be a scholar. The scholar is someone that's not relevant to you, and you still can figure out what that person, put themselves in their shoes and figure out what would they argue. But when it's your life, you find what is, because it's negated to you. I gave also the example from the Rashbats about the reading of the letter. So Sadas, the reading of the letter, that the person who's reading the letter about the guy, unfortunately, his father's passing. So the reader of the letter, didn't affect him. He continued reading, but the person who was listening, even though he can't read, fainted because it was his Zayin Tate. That's the expression. It's his father. So Das is not just taking an abstract idea, but it makes it relevant to you. Identify, hakara. Just repeating what we learned, just to bring it back. This was the longer discussion on page 1175 and 1176 primarily. So now he says, going back now, tachlis idea shalei neda. He says like this. Who? Okay. But Inyan hu das hu hakara. Das, as we just said, das is hakara. It's a recognition, something that you recognize as being yours, relating to you. Harishayich la'acher hasoga. That is possible after there's hasoga, after there's comprehension. The kashamasik is an inyan, when he comprehends a particular inyan. And remember, comprehending is not yet hakara, it's not yet das. It's not that identification and recognition and personalization. He says, so when you learn something, you comprehend something. Now, through you're binding yourself to the idea. So you begin learning the idea, but it's not yet relevant to you. You don't yet feel and relate and say, this is mine. This is, like I said before, with the painting or the field or other examples. So he says, but the order is you begin. So he says like this. That first you comprehend the thing, and then by binding yourself, and immersing yourself in depth, then the person comes to a state of recognition and feeling it. So it's more than just he learned an idea. The idea has now become something that he relates to, and it's become, yes, this is an idea I have completely absorbed. I've absorbed and I relate to, and I can feel. So that is the das that comes after comprehension. Ach, tachlis inyan hadas. The ultimate of das is higher than that. This level of das we just said, it's coming from an understanding. It's not just understanding. The understanding leads you to a deeper relationship with the idea that you understood. But now he says there's a higher state of das. And that is, the ultimate of das is to recognize a thing that's beyond you. That's not known and comprehended. Klal, at all. I understand we need explanations, so let's read and then I'll explain, see what the Rebbe Rashab is going to say. So what does this mean then? You're calling it das. Why is it called amunah? That should be called faith. The first level of das makes sense. Chachma, bina, das. You start with a point, a flash of an idea, a concept. You conceive of something. Then bina, you develop it. You fully comprehend it and understand it. It's still not das. Then it comes, like he says in Tanya that he quoted earlier, that mekasher atzmei b'kesher omitz v'chazak. You bind yourself to the idea. You get so immersed in it, it becomes yours. Fine. So that is 3 levels in intelligence, like we said earlier. Chachma, bina, das. And das is the hakara and the hargosha element of intelligence. But now you're telling me there's another higher level of das that's not about knowing and understanding. In other words, it's not about following bina, the hasaga leading to hakara, understanding leading to recognition and identification and internalization, I should say as well. So what is this thing called Das Elyon, this higher level, this tachlis idea, that you now relay, you're knowing something that's beyond knowledge and beyond understanding. It seems like a contradiction. If it's the first level, follows understanding. Now we're talking about reaching a place that's beyond understanding. And like I just asked, why don't you call that faith? Faith, understanding. You know, seichel reaches till here. Chachma bina das hasaga. Then comes a level of faith, but he's calling it das. Tachlis idea. So now he's going to explain what this is. What level of das is this? Is it understanding or is it not? Is it das? Is it a recognition? Is it an intellectual faculty or is it not? So now he's going to explain. I remember I referred to you, Maimer of Eter, talks a lot about das. So he says, explains elsewhere, and the Rebbe Rashab says where? B'dibra maschel tiku Eter. Eter is Tofresh Ayin. This we're learning now is Hemshech Ayin Beis. It began in 1912. Eter began in 1910 or 1909 to be precise, in Rosh Hashanah. We're now in Tofresh Ayin Vov, the beginning of Ayin Vov, which was 1915. Basically, Eter was 5-6 years earlier than this. So there's a Hemshech called Eter, Sefer HaMorim Eter. It's just, remember the Rebbe Rashab doesn't like to write out the word Tofresh Ayin, has the word Ra. So you write Eter. Eter, of course, also means from Atara. Eter is like a crown. Like here, when he writes Eteru, Ayin Tofresh Vav. So Tiku Eter. So what did we learn there? The Hainu, this means, this level that we're talking about, Tachlis Eidir Shalei Neda, that the ultimate of knowledge is coming to a hakara in a level that is not known and not understood, more than just the first level of das, which follows hasaga, understanding. He says, what is it? What is the hainu? What is this level? The hainu gam ma shalei bo b'chinas hasaga sashlila. That this, what we're discussing, is also something that you don't relate to in hasaga sashlila either. Because you could argue, let's explain what hasaga sashlila is first. In Hasaga itself, in understanding an idea, there's two ways to understand something. It's called Hasagas HaChiyuv and Hasagas HaShlila. Hasagas HaChiyuv is essentially interpolation and extrapolation. Hasagas HaChiyuv means you study something, you don't yet know what it is, but let's say you dissect it, you take it apart. It could be anything, an idea or an object, and you come to realize, now I understand what it is. Hasagas HaShlila is you never come to a direct observation or direct understanding of something. You extrapolate because you don't have it before you. So you extrapolate and say that even though I can't see the idea directly, I extrapolate that it's like through process of elimination. The classical example of Hasagas HaShlila is in Chassidus, is when you say the Eibush is a Chachma Bina. You say God has Chachma Bina. That's correct. But then you come to an appreciation that he's not Chachim v'lo b'Chachma Yediyah. We say he's wise, but not with the knowable wisdom. He Bina, but not with the knowable knowledge. Like we say, Haneta Ayin, Hayetzer Ayin lo yabit. God created an eye so he doesn't see, but you can't say that God sees like we see. So you can't say he doesn't see. You can't say he sees like we see. So we say he sees, but not the way we see things. So shlila is essentially meaning you can't fully comprehend the thing directly. So you essentially extrapolate and understand it through its negating it by saying, okay, I can't see it directly, but I can see it indirectly by saying it's not this, it's not that, it's not that. And then slowly you come to some type. The Rambam says there are enough shlilas. The Alter Rebbe brings in Likutei Torah Pekudei. He says through enough shlilas, through enough process of elimination, you can come to sensing something that is. I give an example for this, a psychological. When you talk about trying to understand the human psyche, no one has ever seen the human psyche. We don't know what it looks like, the soul. At the same time, we could figure out things about it, not chiyuv through shlila. For example, when you talk to somebody, you can provoke them. You talk about different matters. You talk about their mother, their father, their childhood, early experiences, their different relationships. And even though you are not there in their childhood or with those relationships, but by feeling it out, you can paint a picture. It's something like sonar. You know, sonar essentially bounces airwaves under the water, and as a result, it bounces off objects, a submarine or other objects. So you don't see it directly, you see it through its bounce back. It's like shooting a light on something and you see how it bounces back. So you know, an example. Let's say an imaginary wall is shrouded in darkness. You can't see the wall, so you don't know what it looks like. You can't go over and touch it, you can't shine a light. So what can you do to figure out what this wall is like? You take a rubber ball and you start bouncing it on the wall. When it bounces back straight, you know the wall is smooth. If it bounces back to the right, you know there must be an incline in the wall that's to the left. If you bounce enough times, what will happen? You'll never see the physical wall directly, but through shlila, you come to paint a picture of the wall. This happens many times, that you can trace it through its reaction or how it bounces back to us. Like, how do they discover a black hole? You can't see a black hole because it doesn't release any light. It's too powerful, the gravitational pull, to release light. But you see its effect on bodies around it. So, for example, if there was a very powerful magnet right now in your house behind your wall, you wouldn't see the magnet, but you suddenly see metal objects are moving strangely. So you extrapolate there must be a force that's moving them. Just an examples of Yediyas HaShlila. Now, Yediyas HaShlila is not emunah, it's not faith. It's knowing. You just don't know it directly, you know it indirectly. Basically, when x-rays are taken or other scans, some of them are direct, some of them are bouncing off like a sonogram. And that bounce off tells you about the object. It's not mamish shlila, but it's the idea of not direct, but indirect. In the context of, like I said, with the Eibishter, that is chachma, but not chachma as we know it, that's like Yediyas HaShlila, that we know he's not this, and therefore you come to a conclusion that he must be something beyond. And with enough shlilas, as I said, you can come to some picture. So what he says in Eter, and I correct myself, before I said that the Eter explains what he's going to say here, he says no. In Eter, he's saying, negating that Tachlis HaYediyah Shalei Neda is not just the things that it's not just knowing that which is beyond Chiyuv. And Shlila, the truth is, it's Lahakit Ein Sof Shalei Neda Nusuk, also Gamma Shalei Bo B'chinas HaSogas HaShlila. So in other words, Das that we're talking about is a Das that's like Yediyas HaChiyuv, that follows Hasaga understanding. There's a Das of Yediyas HaShlila, which you're negating, but it's still Das. And that's not what we're discussing now, the higher level of Das Elyon. He says, Gam HaShalei Bo B'chinas HaSoga HaShlila Gam Kain. It's also not that. So then what is it? So what is this higher level of Das that he calls is feeling Atzmus Ein Sof? That's Lamaila. One second, I'm sorry. The Haki to say so, Shalei Neda Umusag. That's not known and not understood. Because now he's taking us, Das, and he's taking us on a journey all the way to that level. What is that level? So now he's going to answer that. So he says, what is it? For who? And this higher level, that Tachlis HaYediyah, the ultimate of knowledge, is coming to know that which is not knowable and not understandable. Hu Masha'etzem HaNefesh, the core soul, Makir Margish Atzmus Ein Sof. Senses, Makir recognizes and feels the core of Ein Sof, of the infinite, because it is its root and its source. So he's talking now of the Etzem HaNeshama. Till now, Ru'usa Deliba, if you look, he didn't say Etzem HaNeshama. What he said there, the Lashon and Perik Yates was, the soul, like a flame, wants to connect to its source. So yes, it was higher than Eris and Kalim of Das Tachten. So therefore it was called Das Elyon. But it's the bitl of Chachma Sheba Nefesh. It wasn't the bitl of Etzem HaNefesh. So Ru'usa Deliba is not Etzem HaNeshama. Now he's going deeper. That one was, that was Das Elyon in Atzilus. Now he's going and saying it's Etzem HaNefesh that recognizes and feels Atzmus Ein Sof because that is its Shashe Umekede. Because it is root and its source. Ukamoi, Haiskashus Atzmi the Neshama. Why is it a kamoi? It sounds like the same level. Like the core connection, the core skashus, attachment of the soul. Shazel mitzad etzem haneshama. That's due to the etzem haneshama that's connected to its source. Lo ya'idei izbonus, not through contemplation. V'gam lo b'bchinas ha'aflo da'ed ein sof, and also not through contemplating on the wonder and the grandiosity and the flow, the wonder of Ein Sof. In other words, there's understanding godliness, and hafla, he says, is also, we're not talking about that. That's also appreciation of something beyond, which seems to be the level of Das Elyon that he spoke about earlier, Rusa Deliva. Though he didn't use the word hafla there, but that's what it sounds like. Now we're talking about something also. Because the idea has bonus, the idea is bonus hafla v'aremus the Ein Sof. By contemplating on the wonder and the grandiosity, the remus, the exaltedness, there was different words I've used. Remus, the transcendent of Ein Sof. Who he said is b'chinas makiv. Who he said is b'chinas makiv the chaya. That's an awakening of the makiv of chaya. So it's higher than Nefesh Ruach Neshama, which is Tam V'das. Nefesh Ruach Neshama is what he spoke earlier, Eris and Kalim. When he said the idea of Yediyah, Hakora, Hagosha, and Midas Belev, and the Vedas Habirudim al Pitam V'das. That was Das Tachten in the bottom of last page. Hafla and Haremamus is beyond the structure, like we said in the second level, Ru'usa Deliba. That's the level of Chaya. But we haven't gotten to Yechida yet. That's Chaya. Let me just see, there's a parenthesis here. Yeah, a short parenthesis. For who b'chinas ava she'ena tli bedover, commotion is boyer sham. And what is this level of chaya? This is now an ava. The first level of ava we learned is al pitam v'das, which means it's tluya b'davar. You come to recognize and love God because God is your sustenance. Hu chayecha, as we learned much earlier. So there, the nivra, the yesh, is discovering the ayin that relates to it, that gives it life and sustenance. Like you said in the beginning of the paragraph on last page, that you come to a point that you recognize. So there, it's something that relates to you. The second level, what he calls now the bitl of chaya, the ava, the status of makiv of chaya, that's the divine, that's beyond existence. Like he said, higher than the Eiris and Kalim. And this is an ava she'ena tluya b'davar. Now it's a love, like Rusa Deliba, it's a love not because of something, it's not dependent on anything. The commotion is bar sham and eter. Eter explains that more at length. But now we're coming to this third level. Aval makiv the Yechida, the makiv of Yechida, not chaya. Eine gamma days banasanal. Doesn't come also not through the contemplation of God's grandiosity, God's remamus, being beyond. Raksha nefesh mitzad atzma miskasheres ba'atzmus ein sof. This is only due to the fact that the nefesh on its own attaches itself and connects itself in the core of Ein Sof. So it's daved mitzad yechida mitzad etzem nefesh. In many ways, the difference between these three is every day in davening we have three tefillas, nefesh, ruach, neshama, shachris, mincha, ma'ariv. On Shabbos we have musaf and Yom Tov musaf, that would be chaya, and in Yom Kippur we have also Yechida, the fifth ne'ilah, the fifth prayer. He doesn't say this, but it's just to give a little more grounding to it. So he's now described this third level of etzem and neshama connecting to the etzem of Ein Sof. Didn't explain what it means, just stated it. I will explain. I just want to read it inside as completely as we can. And then we'll go back to explain it. Not only that, I believe that this probably corresponds to the three interpretations in Ayin that we learned a number of pages back. If you remember, Ayin, Hedet Tfisas Makim, and then Ein Zoloscha, Efes Biltecha, and then there's the fourth level. It sounds similar, not completely, because here Hedet Tfisas Makim was the first level. Here there's a level below that. But it sounds very, very similar to those ideas. I don't want to jump and say it's that yet, but we'll soon get there. Right now he's talking in Aveda, obviously. So he's now talked about the Yechida, the Etzem and Neshama. So obviously you'd want to have more explanation. What's the difference between the Yechida and Chaya? The Etzem and Neshama that we're talking about now, which is beyond even Yedir Sashlila, and what we learned before, Ru'usa Deliba in chapter 19 in Tanya, which is still Chachma Shebenefesh. But for the record, right now we have three levels. I'm not suggesting it's all thoroughly understood. So if you have questions on this, I suggest you hold them. I also have questions. I'd rather learn the whole thing, see what the Rebbe Rashab says. Then we'll go back and try to explain. And as well, earlier in Ayin Beis, these three levels have been discussed much more at length. So the Rebbe Rashab is certainly relying that we know what we learned earlier. But as I said, I'd rather read it all through this, and then we can analyze it a bit further.
In the Rebbe's Maimer, Vatu Tetzave, he's talking about Re'iyah and Etzem. I think that this is it. That Etzem is higher than Re'iyah. Because the Re'iyah is a Dover Noisaf.
Maybe. But since the Rebbe Rashab didn't finish speaking about it here, I keep that thought in mind, but I would rather talk about that after we finish what he says here to see how he explains it here. And then we see if that Ata Tetzave can help. That's what I would do before we jump, because it's not over yet. It's going to be all the way to the top of the next page, or at least. And if he did finish saying it, then we can go and analyze it. I just like to want to see what the Rebbe Rashab says to the full picture here. Okay. But keep that thought, because it may very well be that those are the two levels. It's possible. Okay. Now comes, it's a short parenthesis. So he says like this. the be'etzem, he mukusheres be'ein sof. So he's talking about now the makif of Yechida. That's attached fundamentally to the atzmus, to the core of Ein Sof. So he says, the be'etzem hi mukusheres be'ein sof. This is not due to any reason, rhyme or reason, or hezbonus or contemplation. Not chidiyas achiyuv, not yidiyas ashlila, not hezbonus al pitam v'das, which makes sense, or on the hafla and reimamus of Ein Sof, that God is beyond us, because all of that is a result of a contemplation. You come to contemplate and appreciate that God is giving you life. Then you come to appreciate God is beyond giving you life. He's beyond us. Now we're talking about a core connection, like we speak about the etzem ben and av, the atzmus moyach av and the ben. It speaks about in chapter 2 in Tanya. This is not about a father, a child, and a parent are not connected because the parent or the child is contemplating on the parent. That would reveal it. You think about your parent and you fall and you feel a rush of love. But the core connection is not based on love. It's a biological, fundamental, essential connection, whether you feel it or you don't feel it. So why is that not enough? Obviously, because that etzem is concealed. We want to reveal the etzem haneshama into the giluyim, number one, of chaya, and then all the way into naran, nefesh ruach neshama, into tam v'das. That's called a real relationship with God. To say, for example, a person is a good Jew at heart, or etzem haneshama is connected, that's true also in heaven. You don't need this. You don't need to come to this world to discover that we are children of God. This world, you want to reveal that etzem in the giluyim, that a person's life is permeated with it. Remember, a criminal in prison also has an etzem haneshama. But that's not the kavanah exactly. The kavanah is that you should fan the flames of the essential soul. Look, a Rahman al-Islam, a parent and a child can be estranged. Even though they're etzem connected, they can be estranged. They can be at war with each other even. Rahman al-Islam, should never even mention it. Why? What happened? Because the etzem remains trapped in a very deep, unconscious or superconscious place. You want it to be not just in etzem and primius atik and keser, you want it to come into Giluyim, into Rotzen, and then to Chachma, Bina, Daas, all the way to Malchus, in a full active way. So potential is not enough here. Even though the etzem connection is far deeper than the other connections. I'm just pointing this out. If you're wondering, why can't you just have the etzem? What do we need the others for? Because like we said earlier, for it to be internalized with you, you need to work on it to make it part of you. And that's the Aveda Sa'adam, the Aveda B'Keyach Hatzmei, that comes through our effort and initiative. But as you climb the ladder of Das, so you start with Das Tachten, Das Elyon, now we're coming to the Amitis of Das Elyon, that's what he called it, the true, the Etzem connection, what we say in Haishainis, on Shana Rabbah, which comes, Chavuka, Kamayma Chavuka V'Dvuka Boch. It is bound and attached in you. That's Yechida Liyachdecha. Completely connected and attached, the neshama to the etzem. That's what he said. Etzem imukusheres be'ein sof. Vayizgalus de madrega zu zeu shemiskasheres. Because he said the expression that Raksha never miskasheres ba'atzmas ein sof. So if it's miskasheres, it sounds like it's connecting to. She explains the etzem is connected, but to reveal it, that's when you see the neshama is miskasheres, is attaching itself to it. So in other words, the etzem neshama is connected to atzmus ein sof on its own, by birth. Not only by birth, from the deepest levels in the source. But to reveal this level, that's what's called miskasheres. He's qualifying why he wrote miskasheres when it's be'etzem that way. There is, because there's also a process where let's say on Yom Kippur, the etzem and neshama is connected. But Yom Kippur, we do aveda on that level to connect in a revealed way the etzem with the etzem. The etzem of neshama with the etzem of elikus. U'kumoy kein, hu b'hakodesh hanefesh mitzad atzma makeres b'chinas atzmus ein sof. He's continuing to explaining this level here. Same thing that we just said about the soul, the etzem and neshama connecting to the etzem that where it's rooted. It's also in the hakara of the nefesh. I think he wants to put it into the language of hakara, Daas, that the nefesh recognizes its parent, basically. It's like a child recognizing its parent. So it's not just a recognition that came through his bananus. In other words, you contemplated, you learned, and you studied, and then you come to a deep hakara, and you see, I identify with this. That's an identification that came through his bananus. Like he said before, first you understand, and then you attach yourself to it. Now we're talking about an attachment that's coming from because you're fundamentally attached. I gave before the example with an art. You're looking at art, and not just you're understanding it and appreciating it, but you bind yourself with it. That doesn't mean that you are one with the art, fundamentally. It's not your art. The artist made it. It's just through your effort, you've now completely bonded with it. Bonded is a good word actually here as well. You bonded with it. We're talking now the other way around. You're fundamentally connected to it. And this level of yediyah is what you are revealing, the fundamental connection. That would be like very different than what I just said. So you can bond with something that's not necessarily because you're fundamentally connected to it. You just now made it connected to you on the koiches level. Now we're talking about that you've come to a point where the etzem is connected. And that's what you're revealing in your connection. So he says, this is how kodesh hanefesh mitzad atzma makeres, on its own, not through work, not through, his bananus, that the nefesh on its own, makeres b'chinas atzmus ein sof, it recognizes the core of ein sof. Now, what does this mean? I mean, we have the mishalim, for example, by Tchiyah Shefer, when the child is lost in the woods, and you blow the shofar, and the shofar is the sound that he heard in the palace. Or the other way around, the father hears the child cry, right away knows it's my child's cry. So that's an example, not because of his bananus, that's because I recognize my child, I recognize my parent. So there's something about the neshama recognizing its essence, God. So he's going to say, U'kamayel derech moshel, for example, Hargoshes halev, Shalev margish ma she'ena yedeya. That the lev feels something that it does not understand, that it does not know. U'kamei lev yedeya, like the lev knows. This can sometimes be equated with intuition, even though I don't want to say that definitively because he doesn't say that word, but he's giving an example that you feel something, you just sense it's right. Not because you know it, not because you can prove it, not because you know it in your Daas, you just, your heart, what he says is, I love your day, my heart knows.
Okay,
he doesn't use the second half, but because it's not relevant here, doesn't want. Moras nafshe means the bitterness of, the pain. The heart feels the pain, it doesn't need understanding it. You just sense and feel it. But here he wants to talk obviously also in the chiyuv, not just pain. Lev Yedeya. Harizeh, again, let's read it. I know we're all very curious and I'm sure jumping to understand what exactly he means. So I suggest let's read it and then we'll review it. Harizeh lemitzad Yedeya klal. This Lev Yedeya, you say, I sense, I know something. Does not a Yedeya at all. It's not a knowledge in an intellectual sense of the word. Shari ein Yedeya ma'uma. He doesn't know anything about it. It would be like, like I mentioned before, a mother comes into a room and she senses her child is there. It's not the idea with proof or some type of calculation or empirical and so on. It's not any idea mu'uma. And nevertheless, the heart feels because the thing is negele be'etzem nafshe. It touches him in the core essence. Something has touched this person in the core essence. It makes no difference whether he understands or knows, or even yediyah as recognition. It's just something that this lev feels. Now, I know this needs explanation, as I said, but please, let's just see. U'kamoy kain, hu hakara de etzem nefesh. And similar to this is the recognition of the core soul, shemakir u'margish eins atzmus ein sof. It senses or recognizes and feels. He's using the same words, hakara and hargasha, but now he's not using them as intellectual tools. He's using them as more instinctive tools. Because it is his core root and source. So one more line, and then we're going to go back and review this. V'zeu amiti is Daas Elyon. Remember, you used that. This is true Daas Elyon. This isn't a Daas Elyon as a result of us coming to understand something that's beyond Das Tachten. In other words, it's not just the divine beyond us. Das Tachten is the beyond the divine within us. This is true Daas Elyon because it's not coming as a process from below. It's coming from above. In other words, it's coming from an essential state. Through this is the revelation of the true Ayin. That comes from the inner and the core of Ein Sof. Like we learned earlier, that the Ayin Amiti goes all the way up to the Etzem Ha'er. Pnimius HaKav, and then Etzem Ha'er all the way in the highest levels before the Tzimtzum. Okay. So this was pretty dense. If you look at the next line, you'll see he's going to bring it now back to Lechem in Hashemayim and Lechem in Haaretz. He's bringing it back to page 1134. We're now in 1180. So we're talking about 46 pages back. Yeah. So obviously we can read on right now, but I'd rather stop a moment and explain this a bit. So let me begin firstly to put it in some type of context. What we've established here is 3 levels. What he calls Das Tachten, the lower perspective, Das Elyon, the higher perspective in Atzilus, as it looks to higher than Atzilus, and Das Elyon Amitis, he called Das Elyon Amitis, Amitis Inyan Das Elyon, or Das Elyon, the true Das Elyon, which is from the perspective of the Etzem and the Etzem and the Neshama. Now, if you recall, when we discussed the whole idea that Seder Shtalshlus is Yesh, Ayin, Yesh, and the Ayin breaks into 2, Das Elyon and Das Tachten, we discussed at length that Das Elyon, the true Das Elyon, is first how Atzmus sees existence. Then he said it's not just Atzmus, it's also in the Oyer. The Oyer also has an element of it seeing existence through the eyes of Atzmus, or the 4 different levels that he explained. That Oyer, due to its dvekus, its attachment to the source, so the Oyer has 4 different levels of bittul as it reflects the source. Where the Oyer exists and it's reflecting the source, but it's completely nullified. Where the Oyer doesn't sense itself at all it is a reflection. Where you don't even have that element, the Oyer is completely, it's only Atzmus expressing itself. And then the 4th level, where he spoke about the 2nd level was that Oyer doesn't have any substance of its own. It's entirely dependent on the source. The 1st level is Heder Tfistas Makim, that it doesn't have any standing. The 2nd level, I just said, Ein Zuloscha, that it doesn't have anything of its own. It's only from the source. The 3rd level was that it doesn't have anything. The only reason you can call it is because it's not Etzem, but you can't call it any substance of Oyer. And the 4th level was how the Moyer sees everything, completely absorbing, and the Oyer is seeing it the way Atzmus sees it. That was 4 levels in Das Elyon, not Das Tacht. That was all Das Elyon. So you see from there that it's all about the perspective from above, not how we see it. Then there's Das Tacht. That's how we see it. What do you say, we? Not just the creation sees God that way, but even the godliness within creation also sees things through the eyes of creation. Because that Oyer has now relating to us, So in Aveda, Das Tachten is the first level that we discussed here. It's basically revealing the Ayin within the Yesh HaNivra. Now we're climbing and reaching Das Elyon. In Das Elyon, as I just said, there are levels. There's the first level where you are seeing it not from the perspective of creation. You're seeing it somewhat from the perspective of Elikus. So the first lower level that he said here is the Heder Tfisa Smokim, the bittel of the Kalim, not the divine within existence, that which is beyond existence. It sounds like the Hafla and the Reimamus. You're not talking about the divine within existence, the divine beyond existence. So relatively speaking, it's Das Elyon compared to the Das Tachten of the divine within existence that relates to us. So when you simply put, when you're sitting and eating a meal, or you're thanking Hashem and Birchas HaShachar for giving you intelligence and giving you eyes to see and clothing and so on. Or later in davening, you're thanking Hashem for other brachas. We say Reifei Chelim. We say Birchas Hashanim for parnosa, for health, and so on. All these is recognition. A yesh is recognizing the elikus that gives us life. The basic thank you that the Gemara says that when you make a blessing and when you eat a piece of food, simple gratitude. Thank Hashem who gave you the food. On a deeper level, the nitzut saliki, that it's not your food, it's the divine energy in the food. But this is all on your terms. This in Aveda is Yechida Tata, Bittul Hayesh. Then comes the next level, where you say, 1 second, is God all about me? Even this, where you're recognizing you're not a yesh alone. The yesh is bottle, but it's still how God is serving you. Everything that you need. So you appreciate God because he's giving you life and sustenance and health and children and simcha and nachas and so on. It's beautiful. But your relationship with God is God as he relates to you. Then you come to realize contemplating. We're talking still Havana Vasaga Das. You come to a new recognition, which is relatively Das Elyon now. No, it's not all about me. God is beyond me. He doesn't need me. God is not defined by me and my needs. It's not just pantheism that God is nature and nature is God. There's a God beyond existence, a transcendent God, what he called Hafla, Veremamus. So you come to understand, 1 second, this isn't just about my appreciation, my hisbonus al pitam v'das, and I relate to God. Now, what he calls this is Re'usa Deliba. You've come to a deeper connection. The neshama is recognizing that there's a godliness beyond, but it's also recognizing it. It's through hisbonus. It's through a connection. Then he says there's a whole new level. You want real Das Elyon. Das Elyon is not even you relating to the God beyond you. It's be'etzem, the connection of a soul to Atzmus. This is not due to contemplation, even though contemplation helps you reveal it. It's not due to you recognizing it. It's be'etzem, the way it is. And now existence, not even the transcendent, the remus and afla of Elikus is relevant, because all of existence is all nullified in the presence of Atzmus. So this is a bitl atzmi. You can say bitl ayesh, bitl mitzias, and bitl atzmi, even though he doesn't use these words, but other places he does. A bitl atzmi means it's not only not about you, I can das tachten, it's not even about you as you're recognizing God beyond you. It's not about that at all. It's about something that is fundamentally on an atzmizdika level. And there's no das as seichel here at all. It's the pure recognition of a deeper emes, not as a result of any particular contemplation and appreciation and understanding, proof, or intelligence. And this is true Das Elyon, because now we're not talking about a Das Elyon that is appreciating God is more important than existence. You're talking about God is fundamentally the only thing that exists. And the only neshama is simply God choosing to take a piece of himself and put it into existence, which is what the neshama is about. So it's not about the neshama recognizing or reaching even Re'usa Deliba, even though from the Tanya, he says it's like a flame, which is a natural inclination, but he does call Chochmah Sheba Nefesh. It's still the Nefesh in the form of Chochmah. There's a Nefesh that's batel. Whereas now we're talking about not something that's batel, like we remember the highest levels of Oyer. There's no that's batel. All it is Atzmus, and that's it. It's reflecting itself. You don't have another entity that's completely nullified. So essentially, the first level is an entity that nullifies itself to the divine within existence. Then there's an entity, then there's a level where you nullify yourself beyond existence. So the primary thing is godliness. But then there's a state where you don't even call nullified. All there is Atzmus. And the neshama is just simply a piece of that, or connected to it. Different words he uses here. That's briefly how I would explain it. So maybe the Atat Tetzava may work. There's, would say Ria and Etzem. I'm not sure what the explanation there is, but this is the three levels he's discussing here. So this is how I would explain it, at least initially. But please, any questions or comments, please?
Is the top level of Misad the emitis yesh? Or we're saying it's the high level?
He doesn't state it. He doesn't speak here about that. I mean, remember, even in the deepest level of Daas Elyon, he doesn't talk about Yesh Amiti and Mitsusi Matsmuse. He just talks about everything coming from the perspective from God.
Yeah.
And everything else is nullified.
Yeah.
I don't think that's relevant here, because that's relevant when you want to talk about the Yesh Nivra and the Yesh Amiti. Here, I don't think he's going there particularly necessarily. I'm just looking. We spoke about that, the Bittul Hadalid. Yeah, what do you say?
That was his perspective, Mamish.
Here it's more about Bittul, not about, this isn't about, he's not talking about recognizing Amitis Simotse, the Amitis Atzmus. He's talking about recognizing Atzmus. This is like similar to what the Al Torah says, that Filuk Tanim, that everybody knows, was the word he used there, that that Etzem HaMoer is Bizgalus. Kulam Yedim, Shem Shemayim Shagar B'Fikol, Kulam Yedim. Everybody says there's a God. Even a child will say, there's a Neibishter. That's talking like about the Etzem, just the awareness that there's a God without proof, without contemplation. That sounds like somewhat that level, not positive, but it sounds like it.
Okay. Where's our Sharish Amiti? We talked about how that's beyond that is beyond the any kind of level of I thought that came from what we call the Shmo or Kugel Ba'atzma, which is not a level at all, so to speak. It's Yehovah's. I thought that was the Shorish in Sham Israel. If we're talking about that's our Etzem a Nefesh, that's a Bittul, are we talking about that level?
I mean, to me, this is clear. You may go back to page 1158. That's when he talks about the fourth highest level of Daas Elyon. It sounds very much like that level, even though he doesn't associate it directly. He may say it later, and I'll definitely keep my eyes open. But this is what he says right here. Look, I don't like to push it more than what he says, because that's enough complicated as it is. Yeah. I think it's that level. That's what it sounds like. Because on page 1158, he says, Dveikis b'mkesh yesh be'adem k'moishi hi ba'atzmus da'kol b'chins ayin be'efes yesh amiti. Heder mitzias legamri. Sounds very much like that level. Okay. Does anybody have any other questions? If not, we will stop here, right? Almost closer to the bottom of page 1180, and I was going to connect it all back to Lechem and Hashamayim, Lechem and Haaretz, and I'm going to go back to the pasuk Yedai Ayin. But I think this is clear. Okay. You may also recall back then he spoke how the neshama too has these awareness of these days. I spoke about the bitli in the Nevraim of each of these levels. That I remember as well. Okay, we'll go over that tomorrow. Fine.
Okay.